Hello everyone, welcome to this tutorial. I've been asked quite a lot about how I do my non-metallic metal, so I wanted to use this opportunity to talk and explain essentially how I approach it. But furthermore, what is super important for me is that this isn't just me telling you what colors to use. This is most importantly about a formula that you can follow to do any non-metallic metal that you want to paint, whether it be magenta armor or even white armor, anything you can think of. Now, the first thing I want to go through is how I approach it. So what I normally do is I have this miniature here, is I usually look at the shapes that we're provided with here, right? So on this miniature, what I can notice is the armor here is rounded, but we have this important divot in the middle. We have a rounded side panel here, and a sort of a cylindrical or a slice of a cylinder up here. Furthermore, I'm going to be painting down here the sword area here, which essentially to me reads also like I guess like a concave surface as well. Now, the way I analyze this is the following ways. I have to first, when I approach this, I have to decide on how I'm going to do my lighting, right? In which case, I'm going to be doing my lighting from up above. I'm going to have this super simple. So my miniature essentially is standing here. I have my light here, right? So what this means is that with the light that's approaching from there, and let's say the concave area, so the armor is something like this, I then have to figure out like how is this light or my viewpoint here going to bounce up and hit that light that's coming up from above, right? If this was, let's say, a circular area, this would probably hit a little bit differently, or concave, right? If we think about it, if we were to look head on, this would just bounce back, right? So it means this light needs to somehow hit something down here and then come back. This is how I approach things. Now, furthermore, he's not fully turned towards us. So if we were to imagine it like this, then what we would see is that the light actually hits the side of the armor here, like from top down, if you can imagine this to be the sun above him. So this means that this area here practically doesn't get any light, right? At least the way he's standing. We'll approach this in a second. What's important is that we understand how our shapes function in this case. So if we were to draw a cylinder here, and we have the light coming from up above, this would mean that the light would probably hit somewhere around here, which would be a sort of a 45-degree angle roughly. So we can essentially assume that when we decide to have the light from up above, we have the light at this 45-degree angle always, and this is how we should paint it or approach it. Now if we have the light coming from the front, which most miniature display painters do, is you have the light at the closest possible area here. Now, furthermore, if we look at a shape that's a square, right, and assuming that the light comes from top down, what many people fail to do is they essentially try and have all the lights or all the shapes be lit up here. We'd only have our pure light. On the side, we'd have our most saturated color, and over here we'd probably have like almost our darkest area. Then we have our sort of our cylinder thing, which would be sort of a mix in between, which would just have a sort of a line of light here. Don't worry, this will all make sense in a second. But this is just the basic theory of the shapes that we have. Now, if we come back to our miniature, as I've said before, I won't be explaining exactly what colors it is. You guys can probably figure it out what is in here, but what we're going to be doing is we're going to paint a slightly bluish armor. Now, when you look at the colors over here, they don't really seem that blue, right? But the second I bring in a color that's actually like white and black, which is this gray here, and we put this in the middle, you suddenly notice like how desaturated it is, and the blue next to it becomes very saturated, right? This is something that is going to be important for the formula. Now, what's also important is that you have contrast between each layer. So in this case, I didn't use a complete black here, so if we put the black next to the dark sea blue, you can practically not see a difference here. You can also see this on the miniature here, where I've already pre-spray painted all the areas that will be painted in a dark contrast between each of the layers. So if you look at each one of these here, you can distinctly tell what is what. Sure, the ice yellow is very close to the white. However, when looking at it on the miniature, then there'll be a difference. Now, our formula is as follows. We have our base layer, which is the priming. In this case, we did it with black. We have our first layer, which is essentially our black plus our saturation. We cover this everywhere, all right? We have our second layer, which is essentially covers our first one to do the black lining, and we define the shape. The contrast that happens here is through our saturation. Whereas before with the blue, the dark sea blue that we've used in the beginning, essentially is just black plus our saturated color, which in this case is a sort of slightly bluish, goes to the base coat. Then we have our most saturated color, and that goes then further on. What we want to do is we want to cover 90% of this area to get this black lining. I'll show you in a moment. Our next layer is going to be a mix between our most saturated and then our light. This is essentially to get, because our most saturated layer, we can't get any more contrast with saturation. This means we must now dig into the value, which is how much white there is present. So we then use these two. The ice yellow can simply be explained as the color of our light. If this miniature were to be in moonlight, for example, you do something like a sky blue. Most important is that it has a lot of white in it. So we can get that contrast up between the layers, again, as the saturation cannot be increased any further. And then ultimately, we have our white. This is where we begin to move the light towards the area, as we just did in the exercise before. So let us begin. I'm going to be painting this front area here, probably a little bit above here, and we'll do the sword. Okay, so with that, we already have this miniature essentially done with the first layer, right? What I've just done is, again, is just the black lining, so you can tell each feature is relatively distinct. We have left the harshest shadows in there, right? So down here, we've, for example, underneath there, underneath like his thing. Don't worry, you want to push that up as far as possible. But for example, down here, you want to leave that tiny little millimeter line that's underneath his collar. You want to leave that, right? That essentially is almost not reachable with your brush unless you paint from underneath, right? The closer you can get to this, the more refined it'll look in the end, right? But for now, all we're doing is we're applying this, or should be applying this layer everywhere, even in the shadows, even underneath, right? But again, respect the black lining. So again, not like underneath there, but to say, for example, if you have like a shape down here that you might want to argue that the light doesn't reach, doesn't matter. Paint that anyway, so you just have the distinctability between each of the elements, right? But of course, if the sunlight comes from the bottom, then yes, of course, then paint the underside there and make sure that that works for you. But for now, we've just applied this layer to make sure that it's as sharp as possible. Now, as we've said, this is our essentially our first or second layer essentially. So now what we can do is we can increase our contrast, which is we essentially take the first thing and we apply then our ice yellow to it. And now with this is where we already begin to move the light of where we want it to be, and where we also begin to define the shape. As you said, this is essentially here a sort of a cylinder. So we'll paint this up here to have the light there. This here essentially is more of a convex thing, so we'll move the light down here where it begins to curve. And by the ball, we'll probably have like a little bit of a ball reflection. Okay, so now that we have this, you can clearly tell already like what kind of shape it is and how much it's bent, for example, right? Down here, you can already sort of almost make out that it will probably curve a little bit too soon. This is where you can also begin to break the shape, where you can make something look curved where it's not supposed to be. Furthermore, here with the belts, I'm not doing anything too hasty there. I'm just adding tiny little details, as these shapes are too hard to define. So this is where I put less layers, or make sure that the contrast is at least high, because in the end, that's the secret behind this entire step. You can see up here as well with the cylinder, I've just applied this. Is super simple. Another thing that's important is you do not need to blend. At a distance, this will always look good. If you begin to blend, you are essentially compensating for the lack of the fundamental understanding behind this step. Yes, I understand it currently looks rough, and that's fine. You can, of course, go back and blend it if it's too aggressive for you or the contrast is too difficult. However, you need to make sure that in the end, you have to get there first in the end to make sure that the light is there. and that you have your highest highlight so that this all ties together nicely. Because otherwise, if you start blending now and things go wrong, then you've just wasted a lot of time to do this. Right, and with that, we have our next step, which is we essentially here begin to create the material. This is where we emphasize the light as well, the color of the light mostly, and in this case, this is essentially ICL. If you want to put in scratches, this now would be a good time to do this. I will say that this is mostly polished or hammered, but also your brush directions matter, so if I go up and down, it'll look much more like carved, right? So now with the armor already ready, or rather the fourth layer down, all we're now missing is our highest highlight, which is essentially our white, right? Which would place directly in the middle of these places. You can see it already reads rather reflective, but the main issue now, and we'll get to this later, is that there's way too much value, right? Or it's not as shiny as we expect. Don't worry, we'll come back with this. This is essentially where I normally also airbrush. But in this case, since I want to make this as beginner friendly as possible, I'll just glaze some more black into the shadows to really emphasize this. Don't worry, I'll show this in a second. However, with the white, be as sparing as possible. Of course, not just like a tiny light, like a tiny thin line, but for example, what is very powerful, for example, down here where it's hitting the light up, would be to have a sort of a tiny, like a little cell shaded area here. For example, for the armor, something like a little circle would work, here a little line and so on. You'll see this all in a second. However, what's important is that this is used sparingly and do not do a secondary light. Do only one light until you feel confident enough to do this. So now with the white down, you can see how this is already like shining really heavily, right? Only issues that the light really is powerful. It's as if he's really close to a bright like light. Don't worry, again, we'll be glazing over this to bring this down. But furthermore, something that I forgot to mention is at this point, what's also important with the third and fourth layer is to edge highlight, right? Because essentially what those edges only are is like tiny shapes of like circular areas. And as I've explained in the beginning, those circular areas begin to catch those light, right? So for example, down here and up here by the shoulder pad, it really sells it in the end, right? That it's a really sharp edge, for example, right? So down here where I haven't done on the shoulder pads, you can't really tell. It's a super soft sort of armor. You're not really sure if it's maybe like rounded off, like down, it's not really catching it. But on the shoulder pad, you could notice it, or the neck guard, for example, that it's a very nice shape. Same thing on the chest. Now, for our next step, we want to essentially destroy some of the work we've done. We're going to glaze or filter or blend in our initial layer, right? We can even put in some black if you want to be ultra dramatic. So in this case, going back to our initial layer, which is just our black plus our midtone, or again, our most saturated value. And we're going to bring this back down. Now, with this step done, the armor is essentially complete. It's already incredibly shiny, from a distance at least. The blends, of course, they aren't that great, and that's fine for us. But what's important is that the light is there, and from a distance, if you hold it at arm's length, it does shine. This now, if you're happy with the light placement and everything, this is where you can now start to blend, right? And make sure these transitions are nice, but make sure that the general area where the values and the shadows are, that they stay there, right? Just that you make the transition a little bit softer. Now, something that you might have noticed that I haven't painted yet is the sort of other side of the armor. Now, this is a more advanced trick, but the light doesn't really hit there. So how do we paint that? It's relatively simple. If there's an absence of light, that would mean, again, of course, no light hits it. However, in the world, we still have light emanating from the area around us. So this is now where you have to decide where exactly you're standing. For the sake of purpose, I'm going to say he's standing on like a rock or something that shines or reflects light fairly well up and is also fairly desaturated. So essentially what we're doing is we're doing the exact same steps that we did before, but now coming as an OSL from below, as our light is no longer coming from above, but this area around him. This is normally why when you look at other people's non-metallic metal, they usually have like a brown coming in from into the shadows as the ground below seems to reflect up light. So we're going to be doing this side over here now with the OSL coming from below, the exact same steps as before. However, this time, neglect the white. So now with our armor in place, you can already sort of see that. I've left a thin black line down the middle just so that the shape is more readable, but technically you don't have to leave that there. However, this will become relevant in a second. Now with this there, you can almost tell that it's kind of almost too bright. And that's fine because as we've done before, we're going to bring this down. The light that's coming from here is obviously our brightest in the scene because it's directly coming from our source of light. This is but a secondary light that's coming from below. So all we're going to do here is we're going to increase the saturation in our shadows, as I've shown before with the cube example, right? So in order to show off the color of the armor as best as we can in the shadows. So this, I'm just using my essentially darker shade. You can use your most saturated, for example, but I would probably use something more desaturated to bring it back down. In this case, again, the dark sea blue that we've used before. But again, this is something that you can play around with. So I've done this fairly roughly. However, I think you get the point of what we're looking at here. Now, one last final thing, however, which is when you have shapes like this and you really want to make it hit, you want to have the darkest point of your miniature right next to the highest highlight for reflective gloss. That'll really make it reflect. We'll do something down here for the sword, and then I'll do something up here with pure black to really emphasize the bright spots of it. Now you can finally see it. The entire armor is essentially done as is. The reflection from the bottom, of course, you can also put that down there, for example, if you'd like. Just make sure that you remain your darkest spot right next to the light so it pops nicely as it has done here. And that's it. And this is how you can do non-metallic metal in really simple ways for all your miniatures in every color that you want to. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comment section. Future AGN here. So I've also made a couple of thoughts about the tutorial and took a couple of days off just to think about it as well. So what's important that when you do this non-metallic metal is that you don't do the secondary light as you see with lots of other miniatures. They just have the one light and that's it. You'll otherwise overcomplicate things. I will come out with probably a future video at some point discussing more advanced techniques, but for now, what's important is that you, as the individual, as the painter, should understand this, right? We have, well, what I've been trying to mention with the tutorial as well is that blending is over-detail. And if you over-detail, all you're doing is you're delaying the inevitable, right? We have some old masters paintings that you can clearly see are not blended insanely well, and the light is rather harsh. But what matters the most is that the light placement is exactly perfect. And that's what sells the idea. I've included here also another picture of another piece I saw on Reddit the other day that is essentially just a knight on a horse where you can clearly make out all the materials even though it's not blended at all and actually really rough. So don't get bogged down too much with blending so far at this stage. You can do this at the end. Once you feel like you're happy with it, then you can make things that you find are too rough, make them a bit smoother. But not blending is not the end of the world. And it's a lot of time investment for a mini that you might not know is good. Furthermore, what I said about the 5 layers as well can be done easily with 3 layers, for example, if the object is rather small. I have a bust here where you can clearly see the ring on the helmet is done maybe with 3 layers at max. It's because it's a rather small object and I want to really emphasize that light on it, so I just did it with 3 layers. That's also possible. If each of your layers is readable, then you'll get something super cool. You know, technically on this one right now, maybe only 3 layers are readable, maybe 4, but that's it. And with that being said, join the Once in a Six Side Discord and you'll find access to this file here. It's a lovely example of how to do really simple metals with 3 different examples of the sword, the belt buckles, and the armor itself. And get testing today, get your examples done, and hope to see you all in the Discord there. Thank you all.